Welcome back, everyone. We are going to start off this section on DNS, starting with a high-level conceptual overview of how DNS works in general, which will then be followed by a preview of Azure-related DNS topics, which will act as a springboard for the more detailed discussions in the rest of this section. Starting off in this lesson on Azure DNS Concepts, we're going to start off with a big picture breakdown of how DNS works in general, including why it is so important, go over some of the basics of how a typical DNS connection takes place, and then we will preview our Azure-related DNS topics, including both public and private DNS, which we will expand in more detail through the rest of this section. So jumping on into it, from a really big fundamental picture, what exactly is DNS, which is short for Domain Name System? The simplest definition I can give for DNS is that it is the networking construct that translates human-readable domain names to IP addresses and vice versa. Behind the scenes, every public and private site on the internet relies on an IP address, typically an IP version 4 format, to be able to access it. However, if you had to type in an IP address for Google.com, Microsoft.com, Twitter.com, and every other website out there, well, that would be really hard to keep track of. However, if we had the ability to translate those IP addresses to easy to remember names like Google, Microsoft, Twitter, so on and so forth, that makes navigating the internet a lot easier. In fact, that's why DNS is often referred to as the phone book of the internet. You can easily look up the phone number, quote unquote, of different websites, or in other words, their IP address, by their human-friendly name like Twitter, Google, Microsoft, and so on. One key point to be aware of, which is going to be another ongoing theme in this section, is that this phone book analogy applies for both public and private networking. Or in other words, a public phone book would be for public DNS, and a private phone book would be for private DNS. In the case of Microsoft.com, which would be a public quote-unquote phone book entry, Microsoft.com would correlate to a public DNS entry of correlating with the IP address of 104.215.148.63. Now, in reality, large sites like Microsoft, Google, and others actually have a large number of individual IP servers that they are correlated with. However, for demonstration's sake, we'll just go with the single IP address concept for now. Regardless of if we're working with a public or private phone book with DNS, these public and private DNS zones will help to translate an IP address to a domain name and vice versa, depending on how we are accessing it. The key takeaway I want to leave you with before moving on is that DNS is critically important to modern networking, in which if DNS stops working, everything effectively stops working. In fact, those of you who come from a system admin or network admin background are probably quite familiar with a variety of jokes and sayings that if some strange networking function isn't working correctly, it's usually always DNS that's at fault. And in the spirit of having fun with it, we've had fun things such as haikus highlighting the importance of DNS to really explain things that just don't work correctly, like you see on the right side. Just having a little bit of fun. So moving on, let's take a quick high-level overview of how a basic DNS connection works. Keep in mind there's going to be a fairly simplified explanation for demonstration purposes to act as a springboard for the other topics in this section. From a high-level overview, when working with a DNS connection, when you're trying to reach out to some sort of a website or network resource, whether it is a public or a private one, that request to connect to a named domain is resolved by a DNS server. Or in other words, when you're trying to go to some sort of public or private network resource, your computer will reach out and ask, who do I need to contact to resolve this DNS name to IP address association? Or who do I need to turn to resolve this request? The DNS server is what resolves that DNS phone book lookup. With that in mind, there are a few key differences on how DNS resolution takes place, whether you're working with a public or a private DNS lookup. And we are going to expand on these topics in the next few lessons. Overall, with a public DNS resolution lookup, a public DNS request to like Microsoft, Google, or anything else will look up what's referred to as an authoritative name server at the location where that domain name is registered or purchased. In other words, a DNS request in the public sphere will go to the public domain registrar, which will list an authoritative name server, which will be the authoritative source to resolve that DNS request with the IP address it actually needs to go to. By comparison, a private DNS resolution request is a little bit different, in which we are not working with a public domain registrar Rather, those private DNS resolution requests will go to a private or internal DNS server or host. In a very simplified breakdown in our bottom right diagram, we will have a private resource contacting either an internal DNS server or some sort of a private DNS service like Azure Private DNS Zones to look up a private resource from which we will get a private IP address and response. And once again, these are only simplified definitions for now. We are going to expand on this in more detail coming up in a bit. So that's great, but what does this have to do with Azure? What is the Azure component of our DNS discussions? There's actually three main topics that we're going to cover. The first is going to be that of working with Azure Public DNS Zones, in which the Azure Public DNS Zone is a managed service that acts as a name server for a public domain, which can host your public domain DNS lookups. We will also cover two separate but related concepts relating to private DNS on Azure, in which we are going to focus on private DNS resolution on only Azure itself, and we're also going to discuss a number of hybrid scenarios in which you need to integrate non-Azure networks with Azure networks and resolve or route private DNS requests from your non-Azure network to Azure and vice versa. So that's going to conclude our lesson as a quick preview of working with Azure DNS and also DNS in general, summarizing our key takeaways before we move on. We started off by learning how DNS acts as the phone book of the internet in both the public and private sphere, which acts to translate domain names to their associated IP addresses. We then covered a simplified version of how DNS connection works, in which a computer contacts some sort of a public or private DNS host to translate that domain request to its associated IP address, and we also covered some of the main differences between public and private DNS resolution. And then we wrapped up by taking a quick preview of the main DNS topics we are going to cover in regards to working with Azure, which include the Azure Public DNS Zone Service, private DNS resolution within Azure, and we're also going to talk about hybrid scenarios connecting both Azure and non-Azure networks and enabling DNS resolution requests between the two of them. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this lesson. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.